This is a discussion on egalitarianism consisting of four behaviors in mobile hunter-gatherer bands from before the end of the last ice age that produced the natural selection for our psychology. And I'm James Walter, and our collaborators are Charles Hamaker, John McDonald, and Darren Nerad. Four topics will be covered today. First, the hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age. Then, supporting evidence from our ancestors, chimpanzees and hominids. Then, three additional evidence, and finish up with a summary. So let's jump into the mobile hunter-gatherer bands. The primary source for this work and my inspiration is The Goodness Paradox from Richard Wrangham, published in 2019. And the figures there kind of summarize what's going on in the hunter-gatherer bands. We have the males hunting during the day. The females are gathering and childcare. And at the bottom, you see the women cooking the evening meal. So as an overview, the thesis of this talk really is there at the bottom in large print. There is a general agreement that our psychological abilities evolved before the end of the last ice age. Some isolated hunter-gatherers today represent those ancient cultures. And egalitarianism, in four behaviors, in these hunter-gatherers was found to produce the natural selection for our psychology. On the right are four review articles and a YouTube on this egalitarianism. And I'll be referring to these papers during the talk. And you can get the originals. Their web address is listed there. Or also my email at the bottom, and I'll send you copies of the paper. So let's jump into this egalitarianism and the four behaviors. So current mobile hunter-gatherer band studies representing life in the Ice Age and our psychological evolution. And these studies are summarized in the black box there at the top. They're anthropological studies that were conducted over 10 to 20 years where individuals in the bands, their traits, their death, and progeny were followed and recorded to draw their conclusions. And a large number of people have been involved in this work over many years. And here it's underlined. Dr. Wrangham's book is probably foremost in trying to understand all of this recent research. Boehm also stands out. He studied 20 different bands and came up with the term the execution hypothesis. So if you Google egalitarianism four behaviors, you really won't come up with anything because we've initiated that perspective and it hasn't quite gotten into the literature yet. But if you Google execution hypothesis, you'll get reams of information. And we just felt that the execution hypothesis had such a negative connotation, was a little misrepresentative, and that's why we're promoting this alternative term of the egalitarianism and the four behaviors to better represent what was going on in the hunter-gatherer bands. Now, if you look additionally in the box there's four more anthropologists in their work in all over the world: New Guinea, South America, Africa. So this work represents kind of a universal perspective on what is happening in these hunter-gatherer societies that we all agree is our psychology evolved before the end of the last ice age, and this is trying to explain why we got that psychology. So here it is in the red box: egalitarianism, the four behaviors. 1, egalitarian behavior: sharing, cooperation, and support for the norms established by the Married Men's Coalition. There are no property rights or accumulation of wealth. And just to further point out, these are extremely complex social behaviors requiring all of our psychological abilities. You'll see that in each of these four behaviors, human psychology is paramount. Number 2 is the norm breakers. Anger, aggression, conflict with social norms was considered the biggest problem in the hunter-gatherer bands. And there again, you're involving all of our psychological abilities. 3A is targeting. So the norm breakers were targeted with planned aggression. We've abbreviated 3 coalitional actions. And the first 2, gossip and ostracism, would occur in the bands if anybody was trying to be a chief or trying to steal or something like that. And they would immediately be attacked with gossip and ostracism and this planned aggression. Further, if that was unsuccessful, they would go on, where there were some cases where there were executions in the bands of the norm breakers. And more importantly is that it restored the egalitarianism in the bands. 3B, targeting also produced in those that were targeted shorter lives and fewer progeny. And this almost by definition is natural selection for our psychological traits. And Wrangham there in green, his quote is that there were the mortal and reproductive dangers of these processes of egalitarianism, norm breakers, and targeting. So going on then to 4A and 4B, everybody in the hunter-gatherer band is aware of the risks of being targeted. And they really lived their lives avoiding being targeted. And so, those efforts are really associated with our psychology too, and further to the natural selection effects for our psychology. And 4B is aborting effects after being targeted, similar selection effects. For example, those that were targeted for execution, following being targeted, they wouldn't be executed until several weeks later, and during that time things could change, and based on their kind of psychological abilities, they could avoid the executions. Going on, thinking further about this egalitarianism of 4 behaviors, really you can describe all of the daily activities in the mobile hunter-gatherer bands being associated with this egalitarianism. First, there were, universally over the whole world was, 30 to 40 individuals in the band. And it kind of highlights the fact that this egalitarianism was hard to maintain. And if they got more individuals than that, usually they'd have a break-off. There'd be a group that would leave the band and form their own band, so that they usually didn't get more than 30 or 40 individuals. And this is subsistence living, and so the values of like egalitarianism, it seems to be universal for people living subsistence living. And they had stone tools, storytelling, daily singing, and really the anthropologists pointed out how happy these people were. It's a very social life, and in spite of the 4 behaviors sounding a little negative, I mean, they describe these people as being extremely social and very happy. 2, there was a gender division of labor. You saw it in the prior 3 photographs of the men hunting during the day, women gathering in childcare, and women cooking the evening meal. It was an interesting communal care of babies. He described, really they never heard a baby crying more than like 10 seconds. There were like 6 or 7 caregivers there, always ready to pick up the baby and help care with the baby. They observed in child rearing a constant no, because of everybody's aware of the dangers of the 4 behaviors, and they really enforce the word no in these adolescents and children. The adolescents are included in all daily activities, and they were described as well-adjusted. And they had allegiance to the band rather than the family so much. In our modern lives, we have allegiance to the family. But they said, really, the adolescents would leave their native family and go live with another family for months at a time. You come back and then live with another one. And this reinforced the allegiance to the band over the family. 3, the coalition of married men established the band's norms, but it was supported by the Married Women Coalition. Well, as you can imagine, the men kind of established some of the norms for their own benefit. And as shown in 4, the marriage included polygamy. Also shown there, the good hunters had the most wives, and women married outside of the band. 5, animist thinking was very extensive. It perfuses everything that goes on in these societies. And animist thinking was ranked. Nature was on top. Men were next and women were at the bottom. But this type of ranking allowed for animist arguments to be used to justify executions or other activities in the 4 behaviors. Number 6, famine, disease, and warfare were constant threats in these subsistence living societies. But interesting, the anthropologists did not see that these threats or these activities produce selection for our psychology. Really, the egalitarianism and the 4 behaviors were producing such strong selection for our psychology that these other activities were not associated with selection for our psychology. So let's talk about the timeline for the egalitarianism and the 4 behaviors. Starting on the left, we have the proto or developing egalitarianism, and at 300,000 years ago was our first identified fossils, Morocco. However, in red there, at 135,000 years ago, is our really one of our primary time marks for egalitarianism. This has been established recently as the time when our full language abilities were available. This occurred in South Africa in the Khoisan community. So these language abilities and coalitional abilities were prerequisites for egalitarianism. And that, so this 135,000 years ago is a really important time mark for egalitarianism. And really, this timing is recently published just a few months ago in Frontiers of Psychology. This MIT group did the genetic and linguistic studies to really pinpoint and establish this time, and it's added so much to these arguments about egalitarianism. So the idea from 135,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, the end of the Ice Age, is the full development and the full effects of egalitarianism with the language and the coalitions. There, right below the line, at 75,000 years ago was our first symbolic art and conceptual thinking with those ochre paintings. 65 and 50,000 years ago, great increases in activities of funerary practices, artworks, and complex behaviors. Another important time is 60 and 50,000 years ago, migrations out of Africa, such that all people today, as recognized, are related. And moving on to this important time point, 12,000 years ago, the end of the last Ice Age. And really, it's kind of the end of egalitarianism, because just think about it. After the last Ice Age, we have farming in the modern ages. We have hierarchical values. And these really complex egalitarian behaviors just no longer exist again. They go out of use, and so these natural selection processes really do not exist in our modern age, and we say they're not active. So the idea is that really our psychology has not changed since the end of the last Ice Age. The argument comes out of there. So this 12,000 year mark is a very important timing. And so the current hunter-gatherers were studied with the idea that they represent this 12,000 years ago and before hunter-gatherer life. And here's some more in the red box there. So at 12,000 years ago, we have these high-quality behaviors and artifacts, as shown in the picture there from the cave art. Picasso, when he came out of seeing this cave art, said, "This is the best art that's ever been done." He even recognized that it's not only the first art that's ever done, it's the first art in the first cultures. And that the fact that this high-quality art can be produced is a very important evidence for, really what's going on in our psychological evolution. All of our psychological abilities had to be involved by the time they made this cave art. And you look at the beautiful napped arrowhead stone tools from that time too. That can only be done with, extremely high cognitive abilities like we express today. So at the bottom there, the recent mobile hunter-gatherer bands that have established the egalitarianism and the three coalitional actions, and the mortal and reproductive dangers are being used to explain the evolution of this psychological abilities, like they could do this cave art by the end of the last ice age. Moving on. So let's summarize here really this new perspective of the egalitarianism in producing our psychology. And so this represents our psychology ability before, at the end of the last ice age and today. And on the left, we've listed there with the 9 areas of attributes that we have, with the idea of trying to be comprehensive about what all our abilities are. If you think some are missing, you could add them in. The first 3 are in red there because these are the 3 that Dr. Wrangham concentrates on in his book. And planned aggression is in the red box because it really seems to be driving all of the evolution of all of the other psychological abilities. And so the planned aggression was that gossip, ostracism, and in some cases executions that were having such a strong natural selection effect on all of our psychological abilities. Then, so we're rating them also, and the details of how we got this rating you can read in our papers. I think we were the first to publish these ratings, and we used a 5-point scale from very low to very high. And so I'll ask you to read the papers to get all the details of these ratings. But in particular, the planned aggression, it's easiest to see how it really reduced anger aggression. Really think about us as a species. We're non-aggressive towards each other. I'm sitting here talking with my friends in the room, and I have no feeling of aggression towards them. And you think of aggression in all the rest of the animal kingdom as really being much higher than us. We're a very congenial species, and he argues very explicitly, Dr. Wrangham does, and we agree with him, that our low level of anger aggression was really evolved because of the natural selection effects of the planned aggression. Likewise, conscience, our awareness of good and evil and good and bad, really evolved out of this planned aggression. You can see the advantages for avoiding being targeted if you have this interior thinking that, and concerns and such that you're very careful about your actions because of the mortal and reproductive risks of the 4 behaviors. Moving on there, abilities 4, 5, and 6, learning, cognition, language, and personality. We're all familiar with those characteristics. And you see on the right they're rated the same as a very high. And the last three, social awareness, aesthetics, and free will, again are related the same way. And I'll be talking more about these later, but with the idea of kind of just trying to set up what's, a complete description of our psychological abilities. So you're probably having concerns and alternative thoughts about this, and it's very important to kind of assuage you that in these areas. And again, with the three pictures there, we're talking about these the hunter-gatherers as shown in the picture. And really, all the concerns, Wrangham addresses them very well and dismisses them. One, the current mobile hunter-gatherer band studies are limited. He argues strongly about this, that really they're found universally all over the world, and really he points out that no effective or major exceptions have been found. Stationary bands, that's a precursor to like farming and modern age, and where hierarchy of values were involved. And Wrangham admits that there probably were some stationary bands. You think about the Northwest along the Columbia River. They early established, settlements there, and which can be called stationary bands. But he said Wrangham really points out that this is not really influencing the natural selection for our psychology. It's a limited group, and it's not it can be dismissed. There's a concern that the egalitarianism selection pressures were not strong enough. But really, this thing about, for example, Wrangham points out that this one execution of an aggressive person every 4 years, which would, essentially take his aggressive traits out of the population, was sufficient to produce our low level of anger aggression. Then in 4, it's kind of a hodgepodge of items here that political points of view are brought up against these perspectives. There's a kind of resistance of natural selection in trying to understand human psychology. And eugenics is always a historical concern. And Wrangham really talks about all of these three and, just points out, for example, nobody today is supporting eugenics. It's been such a disaster in human history for so many reasons. And so those are concerns that need to be discussed, but are not really exceptions to what we're talking about today. Now, alternatives you see in the literature, really quite often you see, we just don't know what happened before the end of the last ice age. This is 12,000 years ago. We have a few artifacts, but it's true. We don't. It's really only the recent hunter-gatherer societies that they found in isolation, making the same artifacts as before the end of the last ice age, that represent before the end of the last ice age, that they've really been able to do these studies and determine that these were the processes going on before the end of the last ice age. And if you read psychology and evolutionary psychology books, number 2, you'll see throughout the books that each psychological trait has its own selection process. And, Wrangham really points out how poor this perspective is, because you're talking about 7 or 8 different natural selection processes. It's just not reasonable. And virtually there's no evidence for them, because if you think about it, they're all arguing that this was what was happening before the last ice age, but they had no evidence about it until these recent hunter-gatherer studies representing that life back then. And they found that these perspectives of each psychological trait for each had its own process is just not true. That it's really these egalitarianism and 4 behaviors was driving our amazing psychological abilities. Part 2, about egalitarians. So this is supporting evidence from our ancestors, chimpanzees, hominids, and early Homo sapiens. So let's start with the chimpanzee, the common ancestor with our chimpanzee compared to us. So that when we say us, it's both 12,000 years ago and today. So on the box on the left, today's chimpanzees represent our common ancestor from 7 million years ago, with the idea that the chimpanzee has been living in these tropical forests. It didn't leave the tropical forests, so it had the same environment for those 7 million years, and it's generally accepted that the common ancestor and the chimpanzee today is very well represented, very well represents the common ancestor from 7 million years ago. And this is a very important point of view because they say all of the differences that we have between the chimpanzee really occurred in our line. See, the common ancestors, like the chimpanzee as it is today, he hasn't changed. All the differences that we see from us and the chimpanzee really occurred in our evolutionary line, our ancestors. So let's go through the chimpanzee. He's living in the African rainforest, is a large primate, and evolved that way because of eating large fruits. Wrangham did a recent study that's so important. He determined that the chimpanzees are hitting each other 500 times more often than we are in our societies. So this is extremely high anger aggression in the chimpanzee. And you see it in the alpha male that does a large part of the hitting, and high sexual dimorphism. And if I go on to say, in his book, Wrangham really points out that really this is a major issue to explain how this 500 times greater anger aggression in the chimpanzee evolved to be like we are. We have an aggression level of 1 versus 500 in the chimpanzee. How did this reduce by 500 times? And so he argues that this is very important for in this discussion. So the chimpanzee troop, it's highly stereotyped behaviors, limited learning or culture, and the chimpanzee has complex reflex behaviors with a trigger. For example, early in the morning, the sun comes up. That's a trigger for the chimpanzee to start foraging, which they do all day long, in a very stereotyped manner. Another trigger is closeness to another male chimpanzee or other chimpanzee. It activates fighting. And these are examples of these highly stereotyped behaviors in the chimpanzee. And their evolution, their environment and natural selection, really it's like all other animals. It's predator-prey reproduction, selection, occurring for natural selection. And egalitarianism in the 4 behaviors is just not present. So on the right there, we'll start our comparisons here with the chimpanzee using our 5-point rating scale. And the planned aggression, the 3 coalitional actions, really are very low. Without language, they're unable to conduct gossip, ostracism, or execution. That's far beyond their psychological abilities. So we say their planned aggression is very low versus, as we were shown in the prior slide, us were very high. We're rated very high in that area. The anger aggression in the chimpanzee is very high. And as I was saying before, this is a very important thing, aspect of this, to explain how it went from very high to very low for us. To explain these natural selection processes that produce this. And the conscience, generally it's agreed that chimpanzees have no conscience. After they fight, they stand up, ready to fight again. Whereas we have this very, interior thinking, interior mind, and we're thinking and considering and very much aware of right and wrong that the chimpanzee doesn't have. So chimpanzee is very low, and we were rated very high. And then just to mention a few of the other psychological abilities, again, chimpanzee is very low and we're very high. Moving on, let's compare hominins and Homo sapiens before 135,000 years ago. Remember, the 135,000 years is the onset of language in our evolution. And it's compared to us at this 12,000 years ago and today. So what happened in the hominins and Homo sapiens before 100,000 years ago? So they moved out of the African tropical forest into the wooded and savanna and wider habitats. This was caused by cooling and drying in Africa, and later by abilities to adjust to all habitats. And you see under there, we evolved the opposable thumb and upright walking. We see next, there was an increase by a factor of 2 in body size, and increase in female versus, actually that should be a decrease in female versus males, differences in body size, which is a measure of domestication syndrome. And I'll be talking more about the domestication syndrome, which is the biology associated with all of these evolutionary changes. And they were eating tubers, cooked food and meat later, which produced more energy. There was, you see there in bolded, there was an increase ×3 in brain size, increased stone tool use, butchering, cooking, showing cooperation. So this also shows reduced anger aggression, and it's almost being defined as part of the domestication syndrome, which I'll talk about some more recently. So early on, when there was, after the 7 million years ago with our common ancestor, you would say there was proto-language developed that were, and proto-conscience, followed by developing abilities up to 135,000 years ago. So from evolution at the bottom there, evolution occurs both from the environment and natural selection. So we say that there was reduced predator-prey reproduction selection that's so important in all other animals. And then we have this onset of egalitarianism in the 4 behaviors, first in a proto-form and then in a developing form up to 135,000 years ago. And the rating here in the box on the right, just for brevity, just go through the hominids and the early Homo sapiens up to before 135,000 years ago. And we say the planned aggression changed from very low to low, very low in the chimpanzee to low. Anger aggression changed from very high to high. Conscience from very low to low. And so this is, these processes are development of all of our psychological abilities. Going on to thinking about the egalitarianism of Homo sapiens at 135,000 years ago compared to us, today and 12,000 years ago. So this is this important time period at 135,000 years ago with the onset of language and strong coalitional activities that are fundamental to the egalitarianism. We see during this period of time from 135,000 to 12,000 years ago, a decrease in bone size, a 15% decrease in our brain size, and these are kind of signs or very strong signals of strong domestication syndrome, which I'll have a full slide on coming up soon about this, the important biology of this domestication syndrome. The family life occurs along with hunting and gathering. There's a strong decrease in anger aggression, again showing the domestication syndrome, increase in language, conscience, etc., fully developed, and increase in stone tools. Thinking then about the evolution, environment, and natural selection, really by this time there's no predator-prey reproduction selection going on that the anthropologists were able to see, in their studies. And whereas the egalitarianism develops with a strong selection for our psychological abilities. So by 12,000, as shown at the bottom there, by 12,000 years ago, our psychology was fully developed, essentially unchanged today. And that's marked in the right there. We say at 135,000 years ago, our planned aggression had increased to moderate, anger aggression had decreased to moderate, conscience had increased to moderate, and that's our rating that we think is reasonable. So this summarized the prior 3 slides and about our psychological evolution. And at the top there we see the common ancestor with the chimpanzee at 7 million years ago, and then our hominins and Homo sapiens, so before 135,000 years ago. So we also say this is early Homo sapiens because the fossils have shown the first Homo sapien at 300,000 years ago. But really the hallmark for the arguments about this natural selection really occur at 135,000 years ago with the onset of language. And then we had the rating at 135,000 years ago, and then on the right is the comparison to the end of the last ice age and today. So, this just summarizes it, and, our 5-point scale, starting with the planned aggression, very low in the chimpanzee, low before 135,000 years ago, moderate at 135,000 years ago, and then really taking off in this last 135,000 years ago to become high and then very high. So it's really listed, we could jump to 2 ratings there to very high. Likewise, the anger aggression and conscience are following that same pattern where it gets to be moderate at 135,000 years ago. And in the case of anger aggression, very low as we see in us today, and our conscience is very high. And then the other psychological abilities there, just follow the same pattern as the conscience. Moving on then, the last part of the talk is further support for this egalitarianism and 4 behaviors in 7 areas. Again, we'll do a little bit more comparison with the other animals, and then talk a full slide on the domestication syndrome, which I've introduced before. And then further emphasis on this 60 to 50,000 years ago and out of Africa. And then some of our kind of original work, high natural selection pressure that we've published in our papers, feedback models and identical twin studies, and personal experience and moral agency. So again, to compare us to all other animals, in particular, it's a very important point to say, why is this psychosocial and psychological abilities of all other animals so underdeveloped compared to us? So on the left box, the animals in the wild, and we say the evolution of all other animals is really, we talk about the environment and its primary predator-prey reproduction, and other factors like temperature, water. And the natural selection, which you have to think of natural selection as a differential survival to produce any adaptations. And those are also predator-prey and reproduction processes and the other factors. And the adaptations in that environment and natural selection is primarily in the area of reflexes, speed, and strength. That's what's producing survival. And there's also limited energy for large brains. raw food and digestion really doesn't provide enough energy for these animals to produce larger brains. And in particular, as shown as the second dot there, the brain requires 10 times more energy than any other part of our body. So that you really have to think of it has to have a natural selection, a survival value that's 10 times greater than any other adaptation in the body to have larger brains evolved. Thus, all other animals have relatively smaller brains. And in particular, the egalitarianism selection that we're talking about today is just not present, because they don't have language, they don't have strong coalitional abilities that are needed for egalitarian selection. Compare that to the Homo sapiens. Really, these anthropologists of studying these representative hunter-gatherer bands are saying egalitarian and its four behaviors is our evolutionary environment. It's really a new environment for our adaptations. And then the natural selection is also this egalitarianism with its mortal and reproductive risks. And we're talking about the period from 135,000 years ago with the onset of language to 12,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age. And there's more energy available, food for large brains. The food preparation and cooking of tubers, scavenging, and meat is providing more energy that is required for a large brain. And then finally there we just say that the egalitarianism is producing the survival, adaptations, and fitness that are the psychological selection for large and adapted, more complex brains that we have today. The next one, let's talk about the domestication syndrome. We've introduced it in several prior slides, and it's a complex biological process. On the left, we think of domesticated upbringing. So wild animals that are raised in our families today, the young are safe, but the adolescents and adults are dangerous because of they become too aggressive and other behaviors from their natural history. So let's look on the right, the domestication syndrome in other animals and in us, humans. In other animals, pets and farm animals, we're all familiar with those, and they're bred for low aggression over many generations, and so they're safe to live with, even with adults. And Dr. Bayev did the research to explain the syndrome in his fox breeding studies. The highly aggressive fox was bred for tameness over many generations. So the biology of the syndrome is decreased aggression, smaller size, increased intelligence, skin and hair pigment changes, and greater reproduction. These are all associated with just selection as seen in the foxes for tameness. You get all of these other adaptations. And then the last point there is a very important part of explaining this biology of the domestication syndrome is delayed neural crest cells causing many of these biological changes. Neural crest cells start in your body during embryo near the spinal cord, and they migrate out to the periphery and are involved in a large aspect of like our skin color, the size of our bones, and that the delay that they see in the fox studies that Bayev showed in the neural crest cells in their the delay in the crest cells produced decreased neural crest effects, and that this was the cause of these many biological outcomes, and that's why the neural crest cell explanation is such an important part of the domestication syndrome. So on the box on the right, think of ourselves as humans, our self-domestication. We're arguing that was occurring primarily between 135,000 and 12,000 years ago, and was produced by the egalitarian processes. That's why we're friendly, And really, during that time, we had a 15% decrease in our cranium, decreased sexual dimorphism, and it fits the biology of the syndrome that has been defined by Baev and is seen in all other domesticated animals. Let's talk about this important time point of 60 and 50,000 years ago, the migrations out of Africa. So at that time, it was our same language and psychological abilities. So the timeline on the top, we have egalitarianism on the left there, developing. And at 135,000 years ago, egalitarianism is argued to be present with the onset of language and the four behaviors in the mobile bands. And that produced the strong natural selection for our psychology that we've been arguing in prior slides. Now, this important time point of 60 and 50,000 years ago, this was the migration out of Africa. So it explains why all people today are similar and related. It also explains why we all have the same language abilities. And we're adding to that that we all have the same origin of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And you think of psychology, it is thoughts, emotions, behaviors. So essentially, all of our thoughts, emotions, behavior come out of this evolutionary processes before the end of the last ice age. And it's why we all experience similar and have very similar psychology. And then to finish up on the right there, the farming and modern ages, when egalitarian was not active, and we say our psychology is essentially unchanged after 12,000 years ago. That still though, our current thoughts, emotions, behaviors really come from the egalitarianism natural selection occurring before the end of the last ice age. And that our psychology has remained unchanged since the end of the last ice age. Going on, let's talk about egalitarianism and high natural selection pressure. And we published the details of this in our third paper. But natural selection pressure is defined as the amount of change per million years. And using the hitting rates, the research that was published by Dr. Wrangham, we estimated that we had hitting rates or decreased anger aggression in this time period from 300,000 years ago to 12,000 years at a rate of approximately 165-fold per million years. And that's a high number, but you think we're only talking about a third of a million years, 300,000 years. And we have this large change in aggression that was occurring after the onset of language. So that, that's an extremely high number, 165,000. And then we compare that to typical mammalian adaptations like the giraffe's neck and the elephant's trunk, as shown in B there. We come up with an average of only 0.2-fold per million years. There's pressure. So, of course, we're interested in a relative natural selection pressure, how our natural selection pressure compares to typical mammalian. So the ratio of that comes out to this extremely high number, 825 times stronger natural selection pressure from this egalitarianism than was probably ever occurring in any other mammal or any other animal in nature. And it's such a high number that we can really start arguing that all of our psychological abilities are coming from this egalitarian natural selection. So D, conclusion. Our relative natural selection pressure is so high that we can attribute all of our psychological abilities to egalitarianism, which includes, of course, the four behaviors, 3 coalitional actions, and the mortal risks. Let's talk about a feedback model for our psychological evolution. Starting on the left, we see the hominids from 7 million years ago up to 135,000 years ago in black, and then the Homo sapiens during the 135,000 to 12,000 years ago. And we say the early Homo sapiens had proto or developing egalitarianism, whereas in the recent time it was full egalitarianism selection going on. Looking at the feedback curves there, we have negative feedback for our anger aggression. So in the chimpanzee, that's shown as the wide circle coming down, and it's decreasing over time, so that we have our low level of anger aggression that we express today. The positive feedback is shown further to the right there. Really all other traits are seen to be starting low, as seen in the chimpanzee, and increasing over time. On the right there, it shows so limited development of psychological traits during the early period, and complete development of our psychological traits in the later period. And I'd like to point out these multiple double-headed arrows there. And, part of the reason we developed this model and published it in our third publication was that we were running into so many arguments about what caused what, when caused this, what caused that. It's, this may be the most complex processes ever occur in nature. And that we think these arrows and these biofeedback markers really clarify this issue that there's interaction going back and forth between these processes, both negative and positive feedback, to cause the evolution of our psychology. Let's go on and talk about identical twin studies and our psychology. It's in A, we say the summary of identical twin studies is 50% of our experiences, thoughts, emotions, behavior, come from our genes. But 50% of our experiences come from learning, childhood development, and culture. So this has been a big enigma in psychology to explain why we have this this distribution of all of our experiences. So B, from the egalitarianism perspective, 1, the 50% experience from genes comes from the strong selection of egalitarianism in the mobile hunter-gatherer before the last ice age, which we've been describing in all the previous slides. 2, the 50% experience from learning, childhood development, and culture comes from the strong natural selection of egalitarianism for learning, prolonged development, and culture. So in conclusion, we would say that the egalitarian process produced the natural selection for all of our experiences today, all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Let's go on and talk about the personal experience. So we experience autonomy, moral agency, and free will. So egalitarianism can give a lot of insights to explain why we have these experiences. So as shown, the dotted there, our autonomy, moral agency, and free will abilities help to avoid the mortal and reproductive dangers of egalitarianism and the poor behaviors, in these hunter-gatherer bands before the end of the last ice age. That there was strong natural selection for these types of personal experience. So in conclusion, egalitarianism in the ice age produced a natural selection, evolution, for our experiences today of autonomy, moral agency, and free will. And details of those arguments are published in both our third and fourth paper. In summary, to finish up, 1, today's isolated mobile hunter-gatherer bands represent life before the end of the last ice age, when our psychology evolved. 2, studies of these bands have demonstrated that egalitarianism, consisting of the 4 behaviors, produced the natural selection for our psychology. 3, further supporting evidence from our ancestors, chimpanzees, hominids, and early Homo sapiens. And then the domestication syndrome, migrations out of Africa, biofeedback model, and identical twin studies really provide strong support for this egalitarian perspectives in understanding our psychology. 4, thus, Our psychology, all of our thoughts, emotions, behaviors resulted from egalitarianism's natural selection processes during the Ice Age. And at the bottom there, I have my contact information. I can send you copies of the paper. This will be up on our YouTube channel and also our Substack there. You can look at our publications there. And thank you very much.